On a barrier island in Palm Beach, Florida, there stands a palace that was never supposed to survive, Mar-a-Lago. The name means sea to lake in Spanish. 17 acres stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon. 126 rooms, 36,000 antique tiles. A house so large that the woman who built it needed a staff of 60 just to maintain it. Marjory Merriweather Post constructed this estate in the 1920s, when she was one of the wealthiest women in America. She filled it with treasures from around the world. She hosted presidents, diplomats, and royalty within its walls. She believed it would endure forever. She was almost wrong. After her death, the property changed hands, changed purpose, and nearly vanished entirely. The government rejected it as too expensive. Buyers walked away. Demolition permits were approved. For a brief moment in 1985, wrecking crews stood ready to reduce Marjory Post's dream to rubble. That never happened. This is the story of an estate that refused to disappear. A story that begins long before architects drafted plans or workers laid foundation stones. Before Post ever set foot in Florida, it begins with an accident, a Spanish cargo ship that never reached its destination, and the unlikely series of events that turned an uninhabited island into the winter capital of American wealth. Understanding Mar-a-Lago requires understanding the place that made it possible. And that place did not even have a proper name until 1878. Chapter 1. 20,000 Coconuts and a Gilded Dream. January 9th, 1878. The Spanish brig Providencia, bound from Havana to Barcelona, ran aground off the coast of Florida. 20,000 coconuts, packed tight in the hold, spilled into the surf as the ship broke apart. The cargo washed ashore on a barrier island the locals called Lake Worth Country. A handful of settlers lived there, scattered along the coast in rough wooden structures. They came running when they spotted the wreckage, not to rescue the crew, the sailors had already abandoned ship, but to claim salvage rights, coconuts by the thousands. Families gathered them by the cartload. Some cracked them open for the meat and milk inside. Most saw opportunity and started planting. The coconut palm isn't native to Florida, but it thrived in the sandy soil and subtropical climate. Within 10 years, groves lined the shore. The island took on a new character. What had been dense scrub and tangled vegetation became something that looked almost tropical. Visitors from the north noticed. The island needed a new name. Palm Beach seemed fitting. The first permanent settlers had arrived in 1872. They found an unforgiving environment. Summer heat reached oppressive levels. Storms came without warning. The nearest substantial town sat more than 100 miles north. Supplies arrived by boat when they arrived at all. Early pioneers cleared land with hand tools, carving out space for crops and crude shelters. They planted citrus and pineapples. They fished the lagoon and ocean. They survived, but barely. The Coconut Grove House opened in 1880 as the island's first hotel. Simple accommodations, basic meals. It served the handful of wealthy northerners who made the difficult journey south to escape winter. By 1890, the area supported roughly 200 residents. A church stood near the water. A post office handled mail that arrived irregularly. A settlement called Sticks housed many of the black laborers who kept the small community functioning. The island remained isolated, known only to adventurous tourists and the hardy souls who chose to live there year-round. Everything changed in 1893. Henry Morrison Flagler stepped onto the island that spring. He was 63 years old and phenomenally wealthy from his partnership with John D. Rockefeller in Standard Oil. He'd recently completed the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine, a spectacular success that proved wealthy Americans would travel to Florida if someone gave them a reason. Flagler spent days walking the narrow strip of land. He studied the coral foundation beneath the sand. He noted the protected lagoon on one side, the open Atlantic on the other. The location offered everything a luxury resort needed. He saw what it could become, not what it was, a remote settlement with basic infrastructure, but what it might be with enough money and vision. He began buying property immediately. Construction on the Royal Poinciana Hotel started in May of 1893. Flagler brought in hundreds of workers. Materials arrived by barge and boat. The hotel would span 1,100 rooms, making it the largest wooden structure on Earth. He positioned it on the lakefront, facing west toward the sunset. But the project created immediate problems. Workers needed housing. The hotel would require enormous staff. Guests would demand services the small island couldn't support. Flagler looked across Lake Worth at the empty mainland and made a decision that would shape the region forever. He founded a new town. West Palm Beach was planned from the start as a support community. Workers would live there. Shops would operate there. Everything necessary to maintain the luxury resort across the water, but invisible to the guests enjoying their tropical escape. The Royal Poinciana opened on February 11, 1894. Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway reached West Palm Beach the following month. For the first time, wealthy Northerners could travel to the island in private rail cars, stepping directly from train to hotel without ever encountering the rough Florida frontier. The guests came. They kept coming. Flagler expanded aggressively. In 1896, he opened the Palm Beach Inn on the ocean side of the island. Later renamed the Breakers, it gave guests direct Atlantic access. A massive pier extended into the ocean, allowing steamships from Nassau, Havana, and Key West to dock with passengers and cargo. The winter season emerged. 8 to 12 weeks every year when America's wealthiest families fled northern cold for Florida warmth. They didn't just visit, they built homes. Enormous winter cottages that rivaled the grandest estates in Newport or the Berkshires. Flagler set the standard in 1902 with Whitehall, his own 55-room residence. The Marble Palace announced that Palm Beach was no longer a frontier outpost. It was a destination for America's elite. The town incorporated in 1911. Wealthy residents wanted control over their exclusive community. They established social clubs with strict membership rules. They passed zoning ordinances. They created a tropical version of American aristocracy, complete with all the exclusions and hierarchies that implied. By the early 1920s, Palm Beach had become the winter capital of American wealth. Addison Misner was designing Mediterranean revival estates up and down the island. Worth Avenue attracted luxury retailers. The social calendar during season rivaled anything in New York or Newport. The wilderness had disappeared entirely. In its place stood a carefully constructed paradise for those who could afford it. Private homes competed for oceanfront. Hotels catered to guests who spent lavishly. Every aspect of the island reflected wealth and ambition. The stage was set for someone to build something that would surpass everything that came before. Something that would make even Flagler's Whitehall look modest by comparison. The island was ready. The infrastructure existed. The wealthy residents had established Palm Beach as America's most exclusive winter destination. All that was missing was someone with enough money, enough vision, and enough ambition to create a palace that would define the island forever. That person was about to arrive. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Bought Birdseye. May 9th, 1914. Marjory Merriweather Post received word that her father had taken his own life at his California estate. Charles William Post, founder of the Postum Cereal Company, was convinced his deteriorating health would never improve. He was 59 years old. Marjory was 27. She inherited everything, $20 million in cash and assets, equivalent to over $500 million today. More importantly, she gained control of a rapidly growing food empire that her father had built from a barn in Battle Creek, Michigan. C.W. Post had started with Postum, a coffee substitute made from roasted wheat and molasses. Aggressive marketing with dubious health claims somehow worked. Grape nut cereal followed, then Post Toasties. By the time of his death, the Postum Cereal Company was a household name. Marjory wasn't unprepared. Her father had groomed her for business from childhood. She attended board meetings at age 10. She understood finance, manufacturing, and marketing before most girls her age finished school, but she was still young, still grieving. And legally, in 1914, women faced barriers men never considered. She couldn't even vote yet. That wouldn't come until 1920. Her first husband, Edward Bennett Close, showed little interest in the cereal business. They had married in 1905 and had 2 daughters, Adelaide and Eleanor. Close was a lawyer, comfortable but not ambitious. He preferred Greenwich, Connecticut society to boardrooms and balance sheets. The marriage deteriorated. Marjory needed a partner who understood business. Someone who could navigate the male-dominated world of corporate leadership while she held the power behind the scenes. She found him in Edward Francis Hutton. E.F. Hutton was a stockbroker and financier with aggressive instincts and sharp business sense. He saw opportunities where others saw risk. When Marjory divorced Close in 1919 and married Hutton the following year, she gained a strategist. Together, they transformed Postum into a food empire. The company went public in 1922, with Marjory retaining majority ownership. Hutton became chairman. They began acquiring other brands. Jell-O came first in 1925. Walter Baker Chocolate followed in 1927. Maxwell House Coffee joined the portfolio in 1928. Each acquisition expanded the company's reach into households across the country. The most important purchase came from an unexpected encounter at sea. Marjory and Hutton were sailing their yacht off Massachusetts when their cook served a surprisingly delicious meal. The goose had been frozen solid 6 months earlier. Frozen food in 1929 meant poor quality. Ice crystals formed during slow freezing, destroying texture and flavor. But Clarence Birdseye had invented a flash freezing process that changed everything. Marjory saw the potential immediately. Hutton was skeptical. Grocers would need to install expensive freezers. Consumers weren't accustomed to frozen products. The infrastructure didn't exist. Marjory insisted. She remembered her mother spending endless hours canning food on their Battle Creek farm. Any technology that saved housewives that labor would succeed. They purchased Birdseye's General Seafood Corporation for $22 million in 1929. The Postum Cereal Company needed a new name to reflect its expanded scope. It became General Foods Corporation. Marjory was now one of the most powerful businesswomen in the country. But power couldn't fill every need. She collected art and hosted charity events at her 54-room New York apartment. Her social calendar rivaled her business schedule, and every winter she craved escape. Her first Florida property was modest by her standards, adequate for a few weeks of sun but far too small for the elaborate entertaining she envisioned. The house couldn't accommodate the scale of parties she wanted to host. Palm Beach was the obvious choice for something larger. The infrastructure existed. The winter season was firmly established. The elite already gathered there every year. In 1923, Marjory went looking for property. She reportedly crawled through dense underbrush with her realtor, searching for the right parcel. Palm Beach was small. Most desirable oceanfront was already claimed. She required substantial acreage with the correct geography. She found 17 acres stretching from the Atlantic Ocean all the way across the island to Lake Worth Lagoon. The parcel sat on solid coral, crucial for supporting a large structure in hurricane-prone Florida. Water views in both directions. Sheltered lagoon on one side, open ocean on the other. Now she needed architects. Not just builders, but artists who could execute her vision. Marion Sims Wyeth had designed her first Palm Beach home, Hogarcito. He understood her tastes and worked in the Mediterranean revival style she loved. But for this project, she wanted more than traditional architecture. She wanted rooms that felt like stage sets. For that, she needed Joseph Urban. Urban was a theatrical designer who had created sets for the Metropolitan Opera and worked with Florence Ziegfeld. He understood drama and spectacle. He knew how to make spaces feel grand without sacrificing livability. He could translate Marjory's vision into reality. Wyeth would handle the structure and floor plan. Urban would transform the interiors into works of art. Together they would create a palace that combined Spanish and Venetian and Portuguese influences into a residence unlike anything Palm Beach had witnessed. The businesswoman who had turned a cereal company into General Foods was about to create the most expensive private residence in the country's history. Construction would begin within months. Chapter 3. 600 workers and 3 boatloads of stone. Marjory Merriweather Post stood on 17 acres of Florida scrubland in the spring of 1923 and described her vision to the 2 men she'd hired. The architect and the designer listened carefully. This would be unlike anything either had attempted before. Wyeth began drafting plans immediately. The layout would be crescent-shaped, wrapping around a central courtyard. 2 stories for the main block, with lower wings extending outward to house service areas and guest quarters. A tower rising over 70 feet would dominate the center, offering panoramic views across the island. Urban focused on materials and aesthetics. He envisioned exteriors with stucco walls and red tile roofs. Arches and loggias would provide covered outdoor spaces. The design would feel Mediterranean but American in its ambition. The collaboration worked because each man understood his role. Wyeth handled structural integrity, the floor plan, the way wings connected to the central block, how the building would withstand hurricanes. Urban transformed those bones into spectacle, selecting materials and designing decorative elements that would make guests stop and stare. Construction began in the fall of 1923. The site transformed almost overnight into a massive operation. Post had authorized whatever workforce was necessary, and hundreds of men arrived looking for work. The foundation required careful planning. Palm Beach sat on coral reef, which provided solid support but resisted excavation. Crews used dynamite to break through the hardest sections, then hauled away debris before pouring concrete. The entire first floor would anchor to this coral base. Post had been explicit about one thing. She wanted the finest materials available, regardless of origin or expense. Urban took her at her word. 3 boatloads of Dorian stone left Genoa, Italy, bound for Palm Beach. The fossil-bearing limestone appealed to Post for a specific reason. It aged rapidly, developing a weathered patina that made new construction appear established. When the massive blocks arrived, stonemasons began carving on site, shaping arches and decorative elements according to Urban's increasingly elaborate designs. The interior would be even more dramatic. Post had located a collection of antique tiles, reportedly 36,000 of them, some dating back centuries. They had belonged to the Havemeyer family, sugar refining magnates who had assembled the collection over decades. Post purchased everything and arranged delivery to Palm Beach. Each tile was unique. Some featured geometric patterns, others depicted scenes or floral designs. Installing them required craftsmen who could arrange centuries-old ceramics in ways that created coherent floors while accommodating irregular shapes and sizes. Other materials came from equally distant sources. Black and white marble flooring blocks came from a Cuban castle. Venetian silk would line certain walls. Carved wooden beams in the Spanish style would support ceilings throughout. The project employed hundreds at its peak. Most crossed from West Palm Beach each morning, working long days in brutal heat. Post made sure meals were provided on site. She had no intention of letting anyone go hungry while constructing her estate. Across Palm Beach, residents watched the structure take shape. The walls rose. The tower emerged. The red tile roof spread across the crescent form. Even Whitehall, Flagler's marble palace, would look modest by comparison. As 1924 turned to 25, then 26, the house revealed its final character. The crescent wrapped around the central courtyard exactly as planned. The tower commanded views in every direction. The Dorian stone had already begun weathering, giving the illusion of age. Urban's instincts for drama shaped every interior space. The living room would span over 1,800 square feet, with ceilings reaching over 40 feet. Gold leaf would accent decorative elements throughout. He designed a ballroom capable of holding hundreds, with space for orchestra and dancing. Each room had its own mood, its own character. Construction continued through hurricanes and delays. Tropical storms interrupted shipments. Summer heat exhausted crews. Post visited regularly, reviewing progress and making decisions about details most owners would have delegated entirely. By late 1926, completion approached. Final fixtures were being installed. Chandeliers went up. Decorative plasterwork received finishing touches. The tile work gleamed. Marble floors reflected light from windows designed to capture sun at specific times of day. The final accounting exceeded $7 million. Adjusted for inflation, that represented well over $100 million in modern currency. It was, at the time, reportedly the most expensive private residence ever constructed in the United States outside of royal properties. In January of 1927, 4 years after construction began, Mar-a-Lago officially opened. Post and Hutton hosted a dinner before the Everglades costume ball. The house was complete. Palm Beach had never witnessed anything quite like it. The scale alone was extraordinary. But what made Mar-a-Lago remarkable wasn't just size. It was the obsessive attention to detail. The antique tiles arranged in patterns that took months to plan. The Dorian stone carved by hand. The gold leaf applied to thousands of decorative elements. The ceilings that soared higher than most Palm Beach homes stood tall. 58 bedrooms filled the wings. 33 bathrooms featured fixtures that Post had specified down to the smallest detail. The tower offered 360-degree views. Ocean to the east, lagoon to the west, the island stretching north and south. On clear days, you could see for miles in every direction. Service areas occupied entire wings. Kitchens large enough to prepare meals for hundreds. Staff quarters for the small army required to maintain a house this size. Storage rooms for linens, china, silver, and the countless items necessary to host the kind of entertaining Post envisioned. The grounds were equally elaborate. Tropical gardens surrounded the house. Paths wound through palms and flowering plants. The property stretched from oceanfront to lagoon shore, living up to its name in the most literal way possible. Post had achieved exactly what she set out to create. A palace that would define Palm Beach for generations. A residence that announced wealth and taste in equal measure. A house that would outlast trends and economic cycles because it was built to permanent standards. The construction phase was over. Now came the part Marjory Merriweather Post had been anticipating for 4 years. It was time to show Palm Beach society what Mar-a-Lago could do. Chapter 4. The Hostess and Her Palace. The first party at Mar-a-Lago took place before construction was even finished. In March of 1927, weeks before the official opening, Marjory Merriweather Post hosted a dinner for close friends before the annual Everglades costume ball. The guests wore elaborate costumes evoking the court of Louis XVI. Post and Hutton appeared as the king and queen themselves, dripping in jewels and silk. The house made an impression even half complete. Workers were still installing fixtures in some wings. Painters were applying final coats in certain rooms. But the main entertaining spaces were ready, and that was all Post needed. She had built Mar-a-Lago for exactly this purpose. Not as a museum or a monument, but as a working residence designed around one central function. Hosting on a scale that would make other Palm Beach hostesses look modest by comparison. Post understood something fundamental about wealth in the 1920s. Having money wasn't enough. You had to demonstrate it. And the most effective demonstration wasn't jewelry or yachts or European travel. It was entertaining. The ability to gather hundreds of influential people in your home and provide them with an experience they couldn't get anywhere else. Mar-a-Lago gave her that capability. The winter season of 1927 established the pattern that would define the house for decades. Post and Hutton arrived in mid-January and stayed through late March. During those weeks, Mar-a-Lago became the center of Palm Beach social life. Dinner parties happened multiple times each week. Post would invite 30, sometimes 50 guests. The dining room could accommodate large groups without feeling crowded. Meals featured multiple courses prepared by a kitchen staff that Post had hired away from top New York restaurants. The guest list reflected Post's position at the intersection of business, politics, and society, corporate executives, politicians, European aristocrats visiting Florida for the season, artists and musicians Post patronized. The combination created evenings where a senator might find himself seated next to a duchess, with a Broadway composer across the table. Post believed in mixing people who wouldn't normally meet. She thought interesting conversations happened when you put different worlds in the same room. Mar-a-Lago became known for that quality. You never knew who you'd encounter at one of her dinners. Beyond the intimate gatherings, Post hosted larger events tied to causes she supported. Charity galas, fundraisers for the International Red Cross, concerts featuring musicians she admired. These events could draw hundreds. The ballroom accommodated them easily. In 1929, Post hired Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to perform on the grounds as a charity fundraiser. She invited underprivileged children from West Palm Beach to attend alongside wealthy donors. The juxtaposition was deliberate. Post believed wealth carried responsibility to the broader community. The house functioned exactly as intended. The crescent shape allowed different types of entertaining to happen simultaneously. She could host a formal dinner in the dining room while musicians rehearsed in another wing. Guest bedrooms meant visitors could stay for days rather than hours. Post ran Mar-a-Lago with the same attention to detail she applied to General Foods. She maintained extensive records of who attended which events, what was served, who sat next to whom. She studied what worked and what didn't, constantly refining her approach to entertaining. The staff required to maintain this lifestyle was substantial. Cooks, housekeepers, groundskeepers, servers for events. Many lived on the property in the service wings. Others came from West Palm Beach. During the height of the season, dozens of people worked at Mar-a-Lago keeping everything running. Post treated her employees well by the standards of the time. She paid competitive wages. She made sure they were fed, the same quality food served to guests, just in different dining areas. She believed happy staff provided better service, and service mattered enormously to her. The house also served as a showcase for Post's collecting habits. She filled rooms with art and antiques acquired during European travels. Russian imperial treasures purchased during her time in Moscow, when Hutton served briefly in diplomatic roles. French furniture from the 18th century, Venetian glass. The collection grew constantly. But Post never treated Mar-a-Lago as a museum. The art was meant to be lived with, not just displayed. Guests sat on valuable furniture. They ate from rare china. Post believed beautiful things should be used, not preserved behind velvet ropes. The marriage to Hutton, however, was deteriorating. Business partnerships don't always translate to personal compatibility. By the early 1930s, tensions were obvious to close friends. The couple divorced in 1935. Post married Joseph E. Davies that same year. Davies was a Washington lawyer with political connections. When he was appointed ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1936, Post accompanied him to Moscow. Mar-a-Lago sat closed for 5 seasons while they were abroad. The house remained shuttered through the late 1930s and early 1940s. Post made brief visits but didn't resume full-time residence. The property required too much staff and resources to maintain while she was occupied elsewhere. In 1944, Post made Mar-a-Lago available for a different purpose. She offered the grounds to World War II veterans who needed occupational therapy. Wounded servicemen spent time in the gardens, participating in programs designed to help them recover from combat trauma. The gesture reflected Post's understanding that her wealth carried obligations. She had built something extraordinary during the boom years of the 20s. Now, during wartime, it could serve a larger purpose. Post returned to Mar-a-Lago full-time in 1948. She resumed hosting, though on a slightly smaller scale than before the war. She was older now. The social scene had changed. But Mar-a-Lago remained the centerpiece of Palm Beach's winter season. In 1957, she began hosting the International Red Cross Ball annually. The event became a Palm Beach institution. White tie, tails, and tiaras required. It continues to this day, one of the most prestigious charity events in Florida. Post built a pavilion in 1961 specifically for square dancing. The 30 by 50 foot dance floor hosted evenings where Palm Beach society tried to master steps that felt delightfully democratic compared to formal ballroom dancing. Post loved the informality. The house had proven its worth, not just as architecture or as a display of wealth, but as a functioning tool for the kind of life Post wanted to lead. A life built around gathering people, supporting causes, and demonstrating that money could be used for more than just accumulation. Mar-a-Lago was never meant to be empty. It was meant to be full. of guests, of music, of conversation, of life. And for nearly 50 years, Marjory Merriweather Post made sure it was exactly that. Chapter 5. The Ambassador's Wife. Mar-a-Lago anchored Marjory Post's winters for decades, but her life extended far beyond Palm Beach, and one chapter took her somewhere she never expected to go. In December of 1935, she married again. Her new husband was Joseph Davies, a prominent Washington lawyer with connections reaching into the highest levels of government. He had known Franklin Roosevelt since the Wilson administration. When the president needed someone for a sensitive diplomatic assignment, Davies was a natural choice. In August of 1936, Roosevelt telephoned Davies at the Adirondacks and asked if he would consider becoming an ambassador. Davies replied that he would prefer either Russia or Germany, the most dynamic places in Europe. The German post was filled. The Soviet Union was available. Davies took the oath of office in November. 2 months later, he sailed for Europe with Marjory and his daughter Eleanor. They arrived in Moscow in early 1937. The American Embassy residence, Spaso House, would be their home for the next 18 months. Post found herself in a world unlike anything Palm Beach or New York had prepared her for. Stalin's Soviet Union was a nation of contradictions. The government promoted itself as a workers' paradise while millions lived in poverty. Show trials condemned former revolutionaries as traitors. The secret police maintained files on everyone, including foreign diplomats. At Spaso House, the Davies family discovered that their domestic staff reported to Soviet intelligence. Hidden microphones captured their private conversations. Yet, for an ambassador's wife, the mission remained unchanged. Diplomacy required entertaining, and entertaining required Marjory Post. She transformed Spaso House into a stage for American hospitality. Formal dinners brought together Soviet officials and American diplomats who rarely spoke otherwise. Post oversaw every detail: the table arrangements, the flowers, the menus. She paired French and Russian porcelain with pink and yellow orchids. The meals featured American products, a subtle advertisement for the capitalist system her guests officially despised. The work mattered. The United States had only recognized the Soviet government in 1933. Relations remained fragile. Every successful dinner, every cordial exchange, helped build the foundation for cooperation that would prove essential when war came to Europe. Post also discovered something unexpected: Russian art. The Soviet government desperately needed foreign currency to fund industrialization. Stalin had ordered the sale of treasures seized from the Romanov family, the Orthodox Church, and aristocratic estates after the Revolution. Imperial porcelain, Fabergé eggs, religious icons, furniture from the Winter Palace, all were available to buyers with hard currency. Post recognized an opportunity that combined acquisition with preservation. She began purchasing systematically: chalices that had survived centuries in Russian churches, eggs crafted by Fabergé for the czars, portraits of empresses, furniture that had furnished palaces. The Soviet officials selling these pieces viewed them as relics of an oppressive past. Post saw them as irreplaceable achievements of human craftsmanship. The collection grew throughout her time in Moscow and continued afterward through dealers and auctions. By the time she finished, Post had assembled the finest collection of Russian imperial art outside the Soviet Union itself. Davies was transferred to Belgium in 1938. The following year, war engulfed Europe. His book about the Moscow years, Mission to Moscow, became a bestseller and later a Hollywood film. Anne Harding portrayed Post in the 1943 movie, one of the few times an American socialite appeared as a character in a major studio production. The marriage lasted 2 decades, but eventually dissolved in 1955. She kept the art. Her Russian collection eventually found a permanent home at Hillwood, her Washington estate. Today, visitors can see what she preserved: the Fabergé eggs, the porcelain, the icons, artifacts that might have been scattered or destroyed without her intervention. Post never considered herself a diplomat. She was simply doing what she had always done: hosting, collecting, preserving beautiful things. That these activities served American foreign policy was almost incidental. But in Moscow, in the shadow of Stalin's terror, surrounded by suspicion and surveillance, Marjory Merriweather Post had proven that her talents extended far beyond planning parties in Palm Beach. She could do the same work anywhere, even in the most hostile environment imaginable. Chapter 6. A Gift Nobody Wanted. Marjory Merriweather Post started planning her death in the late 1960s, not morbidly, practically. At 80 years old with declining health, the question of what happened to 3 massive estates demanded answers. Hillwood in Washington would become a museum for her art collection. Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks could go to New York State. But Mar-a-Lago presented a unique problem. No single family could afford the operating costs. Staff, grounds, utilities, repairs. The expenses exceeded $1 million annually. The Post daughters had their own lives. None wanted the responsibility of running a Palm Beach estate. Demolition crossed her mind. Other mansions from the 20s had already been torn down. The land alone was valuable. Developers would pay handsomely for 17 oceanfront acres. But destroying what took 4 years to build felt like erasing her own history. A different option emerged. The federal government maintained retreats for presidential use. Camp David, Blair House. Why not a winter White House in Florida? Somewhere the president could host foreign leaders in a setting that demonstrated American achievement. The house could accommodate large diplomatic gatherings. The location offered privacy and pleasant weather. The architecture projected exactly the image of prosperity that Post believed the nation should present to the world. Lawyers structured the gift carefully. Upon her death, Mar-a-Lago would transfer to the National Park Service. A trust fund providing $100,000 annually would help offset maintenance. Congress approved the donation in 1972. President Nixon signed the acceptance legislation. Post received the recognition she wanted. Then, on September 12, 1973, complications from a long illness ended her life. She was 86. Mar-a-Lago transferred to government ownership as planned. Problems started immediately. Nixon had signed the acceptance legislation, but he already owned a Florida retreat. His Key Biscayne compound offered everything he needed. A single inspection visit in 1974 was his only appearance at Mar-a-Lago. Watergate consumed the remaining months of his presidency. Gerald Ford preferred Colorado ski slopes to Florida beaches. The house sat empty. Jimmy Carter's administration evaluated the property seriously. Staff toured the house and reviewed requirements. The assessment was discouraging. The trust fund covered barely 10% of actual operating expenses. Taxpayers would shoulder the remaining burden indefinitely. Security presented additional complications. A public road ran nearby. Palm Beach International Airport generated constant aircraft noise. Protecting a president here would require infrastructure that didn't exist. Carter's team recommended returning the property. Congress debated through 1979 and 80. In December of that year, legislation transferred Mar-a-Lago back to the Post Foundation. The government's ownership had lasted 7 years. No president had ever slept there. The foundation faced the same economics that had driven the original donation. Operating costs hadn't decreased. The trust fund couldn't cover them. The daughters, including actress Dina Merrill, had no desire to take over operations. Mar-a-Lago went on the market at $20 million. Buyers didn't materialize. The house was too large for practical family use. The operating expenses scared away anyone who looked closely. The real estate market had softened. Several potential deals fell apart before closing. Without adequate staff, the property showed its neglect. Paint peeled from exterior walls. Gardens grew wild. Landscaping that had been meticulously maintained for decades became overgrown jungle. The house that once hosted royalty sat mostly empty, visited only by caretakers and the occasional prospective buyer who inevitably walked away. By 1985, the foundation made a decision. Mar-a-Lago would be demolished. The land would be subdivided into smaller lots for development. Everything Post had created, the imported stone, the antique ceramics, the gold leaf ceilings, would vanish. Palm Beach would lose another Gilded Age mansion to modern economics. Permits were filed. The decision was final. Wrecking crews would arrive within months. And then a New York real estate developer made a phone call. Chapter 7. Trump's Bargain. Donald Trump first noticed Mar-a-Lago while vacationing in Florida in 1982. The sprawling estate caught his attention immediately. 17 acres stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth, with a mansion that looked like something transported from the Mediterranean. The Post Foundation had listed the property at $20 million. Nothing else on the Florida coast compared to this combination of land, location, and architecture. He was 39 years old. Trump Tower was under construction in Manhattan, establishing his reputation for ambitious projects. New York real estate was his territory. Florida represented unfamiliar ground, but ground worth exploring. His first offer was $15 million. The foundation rejected it without serious consideration. The asking price reflected decades of construction costs and irreplaceable craftsmanship. Other interested buyers circled the property over the following months. Several signed purchase contracts, but financing fell through. Inspections revealed expensive repairs. Each deal collapsed before closing. Market conditions weakened throughout 1983 and 84. The mansion sat unsold. Trump watched and waited. 3 years passed. Rather than raise his offer, he found a different approach. A narrow strip of beachfront property lay between Mar-a-Lago and the ocean. It belonged to Jack Massey, a businessman who had made his fortune building Kentucky Fried Chicken into a national chain. Trump paid Massey $2 million for the land. Then he made an announcement. He intended to build a house on his new beachfront lot. The structure would rise directly in Mar-a-Lago's sightline, blocking the views of water and horizon from the main terrace. Anyone standing on the famous loggia would see Trump's roof instead of the Atlantic. The mansion's most celebrated feature, its unobstructed oceanfront panorama, would be permanently compromised. The foundation recognized the threat immediately. Selling to Trump at a reduced price was painful. Watching him destroy the ocean views while the property remained unsold would be catastrophic. Other potential buyers vanished. Nobody wanted a historic estate with a spite house blocking the scenery. Negotiations resumed under very different circumstances. Trump also understood what the foundation possessed beyond the real estate itself. The rooms contained antique furniture, oriental carpets, porcelain, and decorative objects that Marjory Post had collected across 5 decades of travel. Independent appraisers valued these contents at $8 million, nearly half the current asking price for the entire property. By December of 1985, both parties signed the purchase agreement. The exact final price remains debated in historical accounts. Trump wrote in his autobiography that he paid $5 million for the house and land, plus $3 million for the furnishings. Contemporary news reports cited figures ranging up to $10 million total. The precise number matters less than the outcome. Trump had acquired Mar-a-Lago for roughly half its listed value. The antiques and furniture inside may have been worth more than his entire payment for the real estate. His wife Ivana took immediate charge of restoration. Contractors descended on the property. Roofs were repaired, mechanical systems replaced. Gardens that had grown wild were cut back and replanted. The work continued for months and cost millions beyond the purchase price. When the house was ready, Trump began inviting guests. Business associates flew down to see the property. Celebrities attended gatherings in rooms that had hosted diplomats and royalty under Post's ownership. The mansion that had stood quiet for over a decade was filled with people again. He had paid around $10 million for something that cost the modern equivalent of $100 million to construct. The land stretched across the island in a configuration that zoning laws now made impossible to replicate. Every previous buyer had seen the expenses. Trump saw something else entirely. Chapter 8. A club like no other. By 1990, Donald Trump was in financial trouble. His Atlantic City casinos were losing money. The real estate market had softened. Bankers who had once competed to fund his projects were now questioning his ability to repay loans. The fortune that seemed limitless in the mid-'80s had contracted sharply. Mar-a-Lago contributed to the problem. Annual maintenance exceeded $3 million. The house required constant staff, groundskeeping, climate control, and repairs regardless of whether anyone was staying there. The bills arrived monthly without pause. Trump approached the town council with a proposal. He wanted to subdivide the estate into smaller residential lots and sell them to developers. The mansion would remain, but the surrounding acreage would generate immediate cash. The town rejected him. Mar-a-Lago held National Historic Landmark status. Residents who lived nearby had no interest in construction crews and new neighbors. The council told Trump to find another solution, or continue shouldering the costs himself. Negotiations stretched over the following years. In 1993, both sides reached a compromise. Trump could convert Mar-a-Lago into a private membership club. He would maintain the historic structure and grounds. In exchange, the town would permit limited commercial use, events, dining, and guest accommodations for members. The arrangement gave Trump a revenue stream while preserving the estate's character. The Mar-a-Lago Club opened in 1995. Initiation fees started at $25,000. Annual dues added thousands more. Members gained access to the pool, tennis courts, spa facilities, and dining rooms. They could host private events in spaces that had once welcomed ambassadors and heads of state. The waiting list grew steadily. Membership was capped at 500, but the club distinguished itself in ways beyond its architecture and amenities. Other private clubs in town had long maintained restrictive membership policies. Jewish applicants found themselves perpetually waitlisted at certain establishments. African American families were quietly steered elsewhere. The exclusions were rarely written down but consistently enforced. Everyone in the community understood which doors were truly open and which were not. Trump took a different approach. The Mar-a-Lago Club accepted members regardless of religion or background. Jewish families joined alongside established Protestant dynasties. African American professionals received the same consideration as anyone else. The club reportedly welcomed gay couples at a time when other establishments would not. Whether this represented genuine conviction or business calculation became a matter of debate. Skeptics noted that many wealthy residents of the area were Jewish, but had no club of their own. By welcoming them, Trump tapped a market that competitors had ignored. Supporters argued that his willingness to challenge local norms took courage regardless of motivation. The results spoke clearly. Membership applications exceeded availability. Revenue from dues and events stabilized the property's finances. The approach generated friction with longtime residents. Some viewed Trump as deliberately antagonizing the established social order. In 1997, he filed a lawsuit against the town, alleging that officials were imposing restrictions on his club that they did not apply to establishments that excluded minorities. The Anti-Defamation League praised him for highlighting discrimination at Palm Beach clubs, with its president telling reporters that Trump had put a spotlight on the community's less attractive practices. The lawsuit was eventually settled. The restrictions were eased. By the late 1990s, initiation fees had risen substantially as demand increased. The property that had nearly bankrupted him was now generating millions in annual revenue. Trump maintained private quarters in a closed-off wing while the rest of the estate operated as a thriving business. Celebrities performed at the club. Celine Dion and Billy Joel gave concerts for members. The International Red Cross Ball, the formal charity event that Marjory Post had hosted for decades, continued under new ownership. The house she built for entertaining had found a sustainable future. Not as a family residence, not as a government retreat. As a private club where membership itself conveyed status and access. Trump had solved the problem that defeated the federal government, the Post Foundation, and every private buyer who had looked at the numbers and walked away. He did it by turning expenses into revenue. Chapter 9. The Restoration. When Donald Trump purchased Mar-a-Lago, much of its original splendor had faded. Years of minimal maintenance under government and foundation ownership had taken their toll. Gold leaf had dulled. Murals had lost their vibrancy. The craftsmanship that Marjory Post commissioned in the 1920s needed expert attention to survive. Working with his wife Ivana, who oversaw the project, Trump hired specialists who understood the building's history. Richard Haynes became the estate's artist in residence. His father had served as Post's chief gilder during the original construction, applying the delicate gold leaf that covered ceilings and decorative elements throughout the house. The younger Haynes had learned the craft from watching his father work. Now he would restore what his father had created. Using sheets of 23-karat gold thinner than tissue paper, Haynes reapplied gilding to surfaces throughout the mansion. He regilded 40 rams' heads that jutted from the roofline, decorative sculptures that had weathered decades of Florida sun and salt air. Faded murals were restored to their original vivid colors. The work required patience and specialized knowledge that few craftsmen possessed. Interior decorator Buffy Donlin coordinated the broader renovation. The goal was preservation rather than transformation. Post's original vision would be honored even as the property was updated for modern use. The restoration earned recognition. In 1998, the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation presented an award for the rehabilitation and conversion of Mar-a-Lago. The project demonstrated that the estate could be adapted for club use while maintaining its architectural integrity. But Trump wanted more than preservation. When the club opened in 1995, large events required a temporary tent erected on the grounds. Air conditioning units sat on trailers. Portable bathrooms were brought in for guests. The arrangement worked, but lacked the grandeur that members expected. The white and gold ballroom that Post had built measured 11,000 square feet. It could not accommodate the demand for Palm Beach's largest charity galas and society gatherings. Trump proposed a new ballroom. The project faced scrutiny because of Mar-a-Lago's status as a National Historic Landmark. Every detail required approval from preservation authorities and the town council. The building had to complement the original Spanish Mediterranean architecture without overwhelming it. Architects positioned the new structure in a low area behind existing walls, where it would be difficult to see from the road. The exterior matched the style of the main house. The town council approved the plans in October of 1999. The interior told a different story. Trump modeled the ballroom after the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The French palace of Louis XIV had represented the pinnacle of European royal grandeur for 3 centuries. Trump wanted that same sense of magnificence for his club. Construction took several years. The Donald J. Trump Grand Ballroom was completed in 2005, with the New Year's Eve Gala ringing in that year, serving as its debut. The space measured 20,000 square feet, nearly twice the size of Post's original ballroom. Coffered ceilings rose 40 feet overhead. 17 crystal chandeliers hung from the gilded ceiling, each imported from Czechoslovakia at a cost of $250,000. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors lined one wall, echoing the Versailles original. The gold leaf alone cost $7 million. Trump installed 4 gold-plated bathroom sinks near the ballroom entrance, spending $100,000 on fixtures that guests would encounter before entering the main space. The total project cost approximately $40 million. Critics found the Louis XIV style jarring against the Spanish Mediterranean architecture of the original estate. Preservationists who had praised the careful restoration of Post's mansion questioned whether the new addition honored her vision. Others saw practical success. The ballroom gave Mar-a-Lago a venue capable of hosting the largest events in Palm Beach. The International Red Cross Ball, the formal charity gala that Post herself had founded, moved to the new space. Society events that had previously gone elsewhere now came to the club. Trump's wedding to Melania Knauss took place in the Grand Ballroom in January of 2005. The ceremony demonstrated exactly what the space could accommodate. Hundreds of guests surrounded by gold, crystal, and mirrors in a setting unlike anything else in Florida. Marjory Post had built Mar-a-Lago to impress visitors with what American wealth could achieve. Trump added a ballroom that made the same statement in a different style. The vocabulary had changed. The intention had not. Chapter 10. The Philanthropist. Marjory Merriweather Post believed that wealth carried obligations. This was not a sentiment she arrived at late in life. From her earliest years of fortune, she understood that money accumulated without purpose served no one. not even its owner. Her giving reflected this conviction. During World War I, while still in her 20s, she funded an American military hospital in France. The contribution was substantial enough that decades later, the French government awarded her the Legion of Honor. It was the first of many recognitions she would receive, though she rarely sought publicity for her charitable work. The causes she supported revealed her values. She gave consistently to the American Red Cross, serving not merely as a donor, but as an active volunteer. The organization's practical approach to disaster relief aligned with her belief that immediate help mattered more than grand gestures. When crisis struck, the Red Cross responded. Post ensured they had resources to do so. The Salvation Army received her support as well. Unlike some society donors who preferred prestigious cultural institutions, Post understood that feeding the hungry and sheltering the homeless addressed needs that galleries and concert halls could not. The Boy Scouts of America became one of her signature causes. She donated the funds to construct their national headquarters in Washington. The organization honored her in 1971 with the Silver Fawn Award. She was among the first 3 recipients ever to receive it. Her passion for music led to substantial investments in the National Symphony Orchestra. In 1955, she contributed $100,000 specifically for free public concerts. The gift launched the Music for Young America program, introducing classical music to children who might never otherwise encounter it. She funded these concerts annually for years afterward. The Meriwether Post Pavilion in Columbia, Maryland, bears her name today, an outdoor concert venue that continues her mission of bringing music to broad audiences. When plans emerged for a national cultural center in Washington, Post wrote a check for $100,000. That center eventually became the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Her contribution came before the Kennedy name was attached, when the project was still an uncertain dream requiring believers willing to invest. Much of her philanthropy remained anonymous. She helped individuals whose names never appeared in newspapers, families facing hardship, students who needed tuition, workers from her various estates who encountered difficulties. The full scope of her private giving will never be known because she preferred it that way. During the Great Depression, as unemployment soared and breadlines stretched around city blocks, Post was appalled by the suffering she witnessed. She organized charity balls at Madison Square Garden. She led fundraising campaigns for the Salvation Army's emergency relief efforts. While other wealthy Americans retreated behind their gates, she mobilized resources for those in need. The pattern repeated throughout her life. Whenever crisis struck, depression, war, natural disaster, she responded with both her checkbook and her organizational abilities. The same talents that made her parties legendary proved equally effective at raising money for those who had none. She understood something that many of her fellow millionaires did not. Wealth on the scale she possessed was not really personal property. It was a responsibility, a temporary stewardship that demanded justification through action. The galas and the yachts and the mansions made headlines, the hospitals funded, the concerts given, the lives quietly touched did not. But Post knew which ledger mattered more. She had spent 9 decades accumulating beautiful things: art, houses, jewels, friendships. In the end, what she gave away defined her more than what she kept. That was the legacy she chose.